Hello, I'm Scott Stewart, Stratfor's Vice President of Tactical Analysis, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Tristan Reed, who's our lead Mexico crime and security analyst. And today we want to talk about the differences or changes in the way that we think about organized crime in Mexico. So, Tristan, we've talked about, internally and even externally for a few years now, this concept of the Balkanization of Mexican organized crime and how it's impacting really the cartel landscape there. What does this mean going forward, though, as far as, analytically, the way that we look at organized crime?
Well, one, it's important to remember that's a natural process with law enforcement pressure on these criminal organizations. It's unsustainable to have highly centralized organizations when an arrest of one individual can disrupt an entire supply chain. So at this point now, we are looking at 3 regional umbrellas with a half dozen crime groups in each. And what that means is the days of the Los Zetas against Sinaloa Federation or interregional violence and campaigns against one another, those are pretty much over. Now, instead, we're going to be seeing smaller geographic niches competing for territory.
So you're saying that we're not going to see the huge cartel wars like, Sinaloa trying to take over Juarez, but we're still going to see smaller conflicts in those cities for, turf and.
Mm-hmm. And a good example right now is in Western Chihuahua, actually Southwest Chihuahua, closer to the Golden Triangle, where there are several different groups competing just for that small little geographic niche. All of those crime groups fall under the Sinaloa Federation umbrella, but that shows you the decentralization of the Sinaloa Federation.
So that's basically a result of the leadership being decapitated and kind of falling into these smaller groups that are fighting amongst each other.
The reasons for the split-ups can vary. One can be, where a crime boss falls and there is a power struggle and suddenly you now have multiple crime groups from what was one. But there can also be intentional aspect to it that's obviously much more difficult for us to be able to gauge, where upper echelons of a criminal structure sort of let their subgroups and their lieutenants work on their own, mainly for the sake of splitting up the supply chains, the responsibility for it at least.
Okay, now the splitting up of the supply chains, does this mean that the supply chains are going away or just that they're going to operate differently?
We will see them operate differently, but they're going to continue to expand. Mexico is obviously geographically positioned with the U.S., which means that Mexican organized crime has this advantage because they are the only neighbors to the south of one of the largest consumer markets for illegal drugs. This is going to allow these smaller crime groups to continue to expand. So collectively, we're going to see Mexican organized crime continue with the same trends, where we see them opening up markets in Europe and Asia.
But as far as the ownership now, so we're not really going to see like what we had in the past with Sinaloa owning almost all the way into the Peruvian jungles with the coca leaf or paste, then kind of moving everything up almost to retail in the U.S. So that's going to be segmented, correct?
Yes, it's correct. It's going to be segmented. It's also going to mean that the criminal brand names that we're accustomed to at some point are going to be beginning to decline. Where you're going to have more anonymous figures because you don't have the high-profile, extremely powerful crime bosses, such as El Chapo. So things are going to become much more murky when we're looking at specifically which Mexican crime group is operating in Peru or Argentina, who is pushing illegal drugs to Spain.
Okay, and that is really going to create issues for law enforcement too.
Absolutely,
because it's going to be harder to track. In many ways, it's almost like what we've seen happen, and I'm writing about a lot on the jihadist realm, kind of the move to this leaderless resistance from a hierarchical model, and that's very much what you're talking about happening in Mexico with organized crime.
Exactly. It's part natural process for organized crime and it's part intentional depending on the situation. But it's really the decentralization is a way for organized crime to continue to operate even with aggressive law enforcement pressure.
Now, what does the decentralization mean in terms of the types of crime that these OC cells are committing now?
So with smaller crime groups, even though there are more for security forces to have to deal with, they're less powerful. They're less resourceful. The Gulf Cartel, for instance, the Gulf Cartel was once one of the most powerful crime groups in Mexico. And now it's just a collection of gangs that are operating in Tamaulipas State. What that means is that We're going to see them resort to increasing with kidnappings and extortion, things that because they can no longer make the enormous profits from drug trafficking collectively, it got split up. We're going to see them go towards these crimes, but at the same time, security forces have an advantage now because they're easier targets to pursue.
Thank you, Tristan. That means really that we're going to continue to see security issues and problems in Mexico for the foreseeable future. For more about security in Mexico, please see our Mexico Security Monitor product and the rest of the coverage that we have at Stratfor about crime and security in Mexico.